Do 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 do. 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 Hey everybody, welcome to The Brunt of It. I'm your host Joel Van Brunt. I'm going to keep my voice down because it's late here in Hawaii, early there on the East Coast, and people are starting to sleep. We've got some people staying upstairs from us, and their bedroom is right over my head. So I'm just going to keep my voice down. I've closed all the windows. Hopefully that won't bug them. But yeah, welcome guys. It is Wednesday, midday. If you're going to outsource your thinking, why not do it with somebody you trust, like me? But if you're not going to outsource your thinking, why not allow me to point you in the right direction to build your awareness? Help build your awareness, discernment, mitigate against your emotional state so you can think clearly about the big topics in the world today, including COVID. Who am I? I'm a guy who's had 21 years experience in the military, in small business. I've been in aviation, tourism, entertainment, politics, academia, entrepreneurship, and like I said, the military. I have led and coached teams of up to 280 to 290 people. I've hired people, I've fired people, I've recruited people. I've lived in 16 different states, or 16 different places in 8 different states, and I've worked out of 12 states. So I've literally experienced or worked in all the major cultures in the U.S. for long periods of time. That includes the South, New England, D.C. area, the Midwest, the West Coast, and most recently Hawaii. A lot of my work has also brought me down to Texas. So I have literally seen a lot of the country. I have flown over the country in a helicopter countless times, probably 6 or 7 or 8 times. I have rode my motorcycle across the country, dare I say, at least 4 times. So I have a broad breadth of experience in a whole bunch of different disciplines. I've interacted with a whole bunch of different people. I have an engineering degree from Northwestern. I've been an actor in LA. I have a public policy graduate degree. So I'm hoping that this perspective and my background can offer something of value to you, the watcher, the listener, to help you think maybe slightly differently about today's big topics, the news today, life, social issues, cultural issues, philosophical issues, religious issues. And I aim to have grown-up conversations and not allow things to degrade into a 5th grade recess shouting match, which often is what our political discourse looks like today. So a little bit about my process. I scour the news every day. I look for things I want to talk about and discuss in this format. It's very, very fun. I've been doing it for, I think this is episode 34 now. I've been doing it for about the last 37 or 38 days. And I started this as part of my COVID improvement project. So stay-at-home orders, I lost my job, unemployment, and trying to better myself by these incremental improvements. I'm a big believer in incremental 1% improvements. And so one of the things to do was this livecast, and that's one of my improvement plans. The other thing was to get in good shape, try to get my health right, my diet right, and all the rest. Now, last week, I got hired back by my company because we secured the PPP loan. So as a leader in the company, I've had an interesting front row view of what that process looks like and who we hire back, how we hire back, what do we pay them. I personally have hired about 12 people in the last week and a half, and I'm hiring a few more in the next week. And it's been interesting to see that. But as a result of that, my time to prepare for this has gone down because now I'm working my full-time job, doing the whole Zoom meetings, the whole Google Meet meetings, webinars. I mean, you name it. I am busy from morning until night in many cases. Today was an early morning. I started at 7, didn't finish until about 5, and then put the family to bed, went and did an errand, and then started prepping for this not that long ago, maybe like an hour and a half ago. So I'm trying to cut down the prep time, reduce my notes, and the detail of my notes. I spent a lot of time recently doing really detailed notes with links to the articles and whatnot. I didn't do any of that today. I just kind of picked a bunch of articles I wanted to talk about and then wrote a few notes on them. So we'll see how that works. You guys can tell me if the content quality is improved or worse or whatever, because I want to get better and I want to make my process better and I want to make your experience the listener and the watcher better and more valuable. So tell me, please, how I do today. Okay, so in all these conversations, I want to keep in mind three principles: the principles of awareness, discernment, and sticky narratives. Awareness: are we aware of the big issues? Both sides of the argument of all the big issues, the big policy proposals, what the Democrats put forward, what the Republicans put forward for policy proposals. Do we discern the information? Do we have a good sense of discernment of the information coming into our brains? What's the purpose? Is it to build us up and to make us more educated about an issue, to make us think more critically about an issue, or is it simply to activate some sort of emotional response and therefore reinforce a prior belief? And sticky narratives, the principle of sticky narratives. We all make sense of the world through narratives. We make a story about life. We make a story about our own life. We make a story about other people's lives. We make a story about the state of the world and the state of history. We make a story about history. And I talked about that yesterday, I think. So we have a number of sticky narratives. And anytime we have information that comes in and challenges that narrative, we start to resist it. Either by dismissing that information or attacking it or ignoring it. And then we go look for confirming evidence that reinforces our narrative. And I talked about how more analytical people are more prone to that, actually. I covered that concept a few episodes ago. So that's a little bit about what I would like to do in these shows. Now, getting into the meat, I talked a little bit about improvements and about my note-taking for this show. I hope you find value. I have been doing this business and leadership lessons of the day, and yesterday I talked about expectation management. Today I want to talk about some communication points, and these are things that I found helpful in my own communication style with either my managers, like my boss, or the people who work for me who are managers as well. And the first concept is no hanging chads. So you may remember the 2000 election where the hanging chads was an issue in the Florida recount between George W. Bush and Al Gore. So no hanging chads. We don't want to have communication be left hanging. That's kind of what I mean by that concept. So no open loops is another way to think about it. If you have an email asking for action or a question of you, that should not go unanswered. That should always be closed. And if there's a question about what action needs to be taken next, that question's asked. And therefore you are eliminating a lot of uncertainty and friction that is inherent in a lot of organizations because of that communication, that friction communication when you're dealing with texts and emails and phone calls and all different manner of communication platforms in these days. So the other portion of this communication is pushing the why and pulling the why. So the why behind the reason we do things. And there's some differences of opinion on this, especially depending on what generation you come from. So my generation, Generation X and above, we were less used to getting the why behind certain decisions. We were kind of more brought up in the generations where you just did what you were told and don't complain about it. Or you can still complain about it. You don't have to. I don't necessarily owe you an explanation for why we're doing it this way, because that's my job and that's not your job to figure out which way we're heading and what we're doing. And I don't necessarily need to explain the why to you. Well, you go down to the millennial generation and the reverse is almost true. They almost have to know the why. And so sometimes when you have this cross-generational thing with baby boomers or Gen X working with millennials, that's going to cause friction. You have that generational, just different way that they were brought up in understanding the way the world works. So I have this adage of you push the why out. Don't wait for it. People are going to ask it anyway. So just push the why. If you're in a management position or leadership position, you just push the why down. Hey, here's what we're doing and here's the why behind it. So you have better context of the decision. And I talk about context a lot in the form of the principle of awareness and discernment. So push the why. Also pull the why. And what I mean by this is if you don't have the why, and it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, you could be a frontline staff member, or you could be a middle manager, or you could be the CEO. And you're trying to work for a board of directors. So if you don't have the why yourself for the direction of the company, that could also pose some challenges, because you might inadvertently make some assumptions about the why that could lead you down the wrong path. So there it is. For communication, the business and leadership lesson of the day is no hanging chads, no closed loops, or no open loops. Close all of the open loops, and then push the why, pull the why. And just these simple concepts, if you adapt them into your daily communication at work or whatever organization you are a part of, you will find, I think, that the friction in communication starts to drop, and it becomes a little bit more fluid. People have a better understanding of where you're coming from. You close a bunch of hanging taskers, because there's open-ended loops all over the place. If you look through your email inbox, you can find open loops guaranteed in about 30 seconds. So close all those. All right, so I talk a lot about my process about reading the news regularly. Now, me personally, I've gone back and forth in my adult life with the news. So in the military, I had access to something called the Early Bird. And this was like an aggregator that was DoD kind of specific information from all the major news outlets. And it was one of my earliest experiences with an aggregator of sorts. And it would give you pertinent headlines that are relevant to DoD and the military. And I used to read this for periods of time pretty religiously. And I'd read all the articles. I subscribed to the New York Times when I was a young person. For many, many years. I still have the September 12th New York Times issue from 2001. It's up in my closet. So I still have that. And then there would be phases in my life where I would just kind of go away from the media. For example, I'd kind of follow it during the election year, or maybe the interim year, the off-cycle years. And then I just kind of like take a break, and I wouldn't really read a lot of media during that break. I might watch some cable news television from here and there. But for background, I got rid of cable in 2006. That's 14 years ago. I have not had cable in my house for 14 years. So I cut the cord a long time ago. So most of the stuff that I get, and there was a reason I did that, because I was wasting too much time getting entertained by the news, but also other stuff, and not enough time like thinking for myself about what's really going on in the world. What are the big ideas? So I kind of did it as a way to personally develop and not get sidetracked by entertainment, especially cable news entertainment. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made. And I started to read more of my news sources. And when you read with news sources, I think that your brain engages with the information slightly differently than when you watch news. That's just my opinion. Or when you hear news. So we have slightly different reactions depending on what format the information is coming into our brains. So I would take these periods of fasting, as I call it, from the news. And one thing you notice when more recently when I've gotten into this, one thing I've noticed is that as you scour the news every day, you'll start to see who's covering what, who's not covering what. This organization seems to have a whole bunch of articles that are in the same, kind of going the same direction. This organization has a whole bunch of articles going the other direction. And you start to build healthy skepticism, probably of the legacy media outlets. But you also start to build relationships with individual people inside those legacy media outlets. And I think that's healthy. I think if you find people that you trust their writing and their thinking, regardless of whether they disagree with you, it might be you trust them because they actually represent the opposing point of view from you actually very well, and you appreciate that perspective. So you get a good sense for that. But you go away, and then let's say you start to maybe hear some headline. You come back, you start to hear some headlines. You start to see maybe a news flash. You look at YouTube, you see a 3-minute clip or something, about a story. You see headlines, through Yahoo News, maybe an aggregator that just kind of pushes it to you, or it's on email. And you're going through your email one day, and you've got, in your inbox, Real Clear Politics, another aggregator that's one of my favorite. And you just scour the headlines real quick, and you can't help but have some sort of emotional reaction to these headlines. And you something happens in our brains psychologically when we read these headlines. Not all the time, but sometimes. And you'll read the headline, and then if you're not really staying aware of what's going on, that headline is going to do a couple things. It could confirm what you remember from before when you were kind of in the news cycle. It could cause doubt of what you think is going on in the world and start to really doubt your understanding. But regardless of which way it goes, it's primarily an emotional response. And if you're not careful, that emotional response can lead into a commitment in your mind about what you believe about a certain topic or issue or person. So we see this, I think, quite a bit. And I would just say that we should be aware of it. We should be aware of it. How much are we in the news? How much are we aware of how different legacy or new media outlets, how they report? Individual reporters, how familiar are we with individual reporters? And if we take fast from the news, which all of us should, and also if you have a high-stress job like I've had for years, you just don't have time. So if you don't have time and then you kind of have this desire to stay informed and you get little bits and pieces of information, you're certainly not getting the full context. You're certainly not getting necessarily the big picture or, the point and counterpoint. And we just need to be aware that first contact with the news after a time of fasting can have consequences on how we think about things. So we should discern the information. We should keep that principle of awareness and principle of discernment in mind, and the sticky narrative in mind as we're contacting with these news stories. Okay, so I want to cover two. So basically, that's a big idea I want to talk about. I'll get more into some things as we go along, but two bits of information that came out that I've covered in the past, so I thought I'd mention them. So there's this Georgia jogger who was killed by two residents. One was a former, I think, police investigator, and his son, and it was a horrible, horrible story. Well, I guess there's a video that surfaced from the altercation, and the video might have some differences of what the police report is from the people who ended up killing this jogger. This jogger was a young 25-year-old African-American man, and it's just a horrible story. It's a very sad story. So that's going to go it looks like, to a grand jury. So I was reading the Vox article on that because I like to. Vox is on the opposite side politically from me, but I like to kind of see what other people are saying about these stories. And then the other story that I reported, I don't remember, within the last 5 days or so, was Joe Biden's record on sexual assault and how under the Obama administration, they tried to change a little bit of the Title IX sexual assault on campus standards away from, a typical presumed innocent until proven guilty to kind of preponderance of the evidence standard. So evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is a different definition legally. And so they were doing that back, I think it was 2011, they passed this, or they were starting to withhold federal funds from schools who didn't do that. And that did some crazy things, like the accused person couldn't question the accuser. So, I mean, constitutionally, there's some serious questions that pop up in this policy. So that was a policy pushed forward by Obama and Biden during their tenure, and the Trump administration just started to reverse that through Betsy DeVos, I guess, in the last day. So they're starting to reverse some of those policies, and of course, that's causing some outrage, as you may expect. So I just wanted to mention those because I've talked about those stories in the past, just as kind of an update to things I've talked about. Getting into COVID-19, CNN is reporting that the Trump economy is about to hit 30 million unemployed, if not there already. That's going to be some of the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. And the New York Times is reporting that the EU is expected to have their worst recession in history, with estimates down that the economy is going to contract about 7.4% annually in terms of shrinkage. So I think it's safe to say we're well on our way to the cure becoming worse than the disease. And I've reported how the UN has suggested that about 130 million people may be starving by the end of the year because of the global shutdown of the economy. So it's safe to say we're there. And so that's why there's a whole bunch of discussion about reopening and how to do it. And then, of course, with the reopening, a whole bunch of finger pointing of you don't value life and you don't value you don't value freedom or liberty, you don't value life, and this back and forth that's frankly kind of silly, because none of it talks about risk decisions, none of it offers alternatives that are viable. They offer alternatives that are pie in the sky, but I think most reasonable people agree that we need to reopen. We need to do it safely. We don't need to jump into it and do it quickly necessarily, but we do need to figure out ways to get the economy churning again while protecting our most vulnerable. And I think most experts are starting to agree on that if you start scouring the experts in the media. But I did want to hone in on one report on models, because I've talked a lot about models and healthy skepticism for models. And there's many models that have come out of this COVID-19. The University of Washington is one of the big popular ones because that influenced the Trump administration. So there was a National Review article today from Robert Verbruggen. He's not a scientist as far as I can tell. He's just a contributor. But he talks about models enough with the University of Washington. And I thought I'd just read a little bit of this because it's a fascinating piece. Of course, did I not pull it up? Oh, there it is. Yeah, enough already with the IHME COVID-19 model, and this is a good few paragraphs to kind of help present some thinking that I've tried to articulate over the past several weeks. I have precisely zero envy for anyone trying to predict where the COVID-19 pandemic is headed. There's a ton we don't know about how quickly the virus spreads under different conditions, what new treatments will appear, how policy will change in the future, and how well the public will practice social distancing during the summer regardless of policy. Even the world's top epidemiologists cannot be expected to give us more than educated guesses that are based on reasonable, clearly explained assumptions, and that improve as new information comes in. Some of those guesses can be quite valuable even as they're quite uncertain. Given the massive funding behind it and the faith placed in it by the now moribund White House Coronavirus Task Force, I once hoped that the COVID-19 model from the University of Washington Institute for Health and Metrics and Evaluation would prove to be one such valuable tool. But those hopes have been dashed. The model simply doesn't work, and the folks behind it are still futzing with its fundamental workings as the pandemic enters its least predictable phase. During this crisis period, when the country is reopening, we can have no faith in the model's output. It shouldn't be used to inform policymaking decisions at all. This isn't to slight the scientists who took on such a difficult task. It's just a realistic assessment of how the project turned out. When modeling epidemics, scientists typically try to simulate the way a virus spreads, exponentially at first, because each infected person interacts with many other vulnerable individuals, and then slowing down as the population either gains immunity or takes deliberate steps to reduce transmission. This process can be modeled in very general terms, or by simulating the specific interactions and infections of millions of people, as the Imperial College COVID-19 model does. Either way, the results utility is limited by the fact that researchers had to make a bunch of assumptions to arrive at it. And I talked about this very early on, episode 1 or 2, where I talked about the models are only as good as the assumptions, and we don't really know how good the assumptions were. We're still building information on how good the assumptions were. So exactly how quickly does a disease spread when left unchecked? How much do people reduce their interactions when advised or legally required to practice social distancing? Which types of interactions are most dangerous? Different answers to these questions can yield very different modeling results. So that's the key, is you have all these assumptions of variables, and it's a multivariate analysis, and you just tweak certain variables slightly or largely, and it can send the results off the charts in another direction. So all these are issues. The IHME model was meant to sidestep these issues. Rather than recreating the underlying processes through which a disease spreads, it looked at what had actually happened in other countries during the pandemic. It fit a curve connecting trends in the U.S. with trends in other places, showing us where we'd end up if things worked out the same way as they had for those places. There were some hiccups almost immediately. Early IHME estimates were 100,000 to 200,000 deaths, but the number soon dropped to 80,000 and then even lower. As I pointed out at the time, at least some of these revisions were easily justified. The researchers were getting important new data, including death trends from countries whose pandemics had recently peaked and updated information about how many Americans were hospitalized for each death that occurred. Models should change when better information comes in. That's how they're calibrated to make better predictions in the future. Unfortunately, it turned out that the model had far deeper problems than incomplete information. One was that when fitting those curves, it operated under an assumption that states' curves would generally be symmetrical, that deaths would fall as quickly as they had risen. There's no reason there's no reason this has to be the case, and indeed imposing a specific shape like this undermines the entire point of drawing on other places' experience to see where we would end up. So that's just one problem. I'm not going to read the whole article, but this is a really interesting example of a reporter validating some thinking that I had early on in this pandemic. And the reason I had this thinking is because I do have an engineering background, and I know that I've studied models in grad school, and I know that we can fall in love with our own models, and people can fall in love with models that back up their sticky narrative. And this happens literally all the time. If you know this and you start looking for it, you will find it. You'll notice it perhaps in yourself. You'll notice it perhaps in your family members or your friends. And so because models can be so far off based on the assumptions, we need to be careful and skeptical with how much weight we give them. They can be helpful, but they certainly can't be the end-all be-all of decision-making. And I think one of my critiques over the last week or two with this reopening debate is that the sticky narrative on the Remain locked down crowd is these original model projections. And they have anchored in their mind 100,000, 200,000, or even worse, 1 million to 2.2 million, which one of the models suggests. I think the Great Britain one suggested as high as 2.2 million deaths in the U.S. So they have those numbers anchored in their minds, and because that's such a bad number, even though a lot of the data we're getting in with antibody tests and with actual infections and actual deaths is suggestive that we're not going to be near there, and that the infection to fatality rate is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.6%. And I've covered that extensively in the last several episodes, so go back and look at my justification for those numbers. But so I'd like to read articles that help to clarify some of my thinking and also present you with some other sources that confirm my thinking. So that's what I wanted to point out. I have to answer that real quick. So moving on. CNN. So in spite of the modeling, CNN and the Washington Post are still critical, saying we're opening too soon, we're moving too fast. And Vox has this piece that coronavirus has killed American exceptionalism by Zach Beauchamp. Zach Beauchamp's name jumped out at me because I think I've cited an article of his before where it was similar in the sense that it was very critical of the U.S. And so you like I said, you see these names pop up that have a consistent point of view in how they report issues. And I think that's helpful to keep that in mind and interrogate that information, have discernment about who is giving you the information, what their prior assumptions are, or what their sticky narrative is. And if you know that, you can take it captive and figure out how much you need to raise your awareness from what they're giving you. So that's why I advocate for following certain journalists and getting a feel for their voice. Okay, I want to transition quickly into politics. And I found this interesting article. Again, this is a person who I was connected to on Twitter. She popped up in my feed, and I liked her writing and I liked her tweets, so I followed her. And so she routinely pops up in my feeds with some good commentary. Her name is Molly Hemingway. She's a contributor to the Federalist, and she has an article that is funny. This will no doubt possibly trigger some listeners, perhaps. But I've thought this way, and I've actually found myself arguing this way with some of my friends on Twitter who are on the other side of the aisle. And the title is, Could media please stop publishing the exact same Never Trump column over and over again? Stop me if you've heard this one before. President Donald Trump is unraveling. Oh, you've heard it like 11 billion times from the same half dozen Never Trump pundits. Yeah, so has everybody. It's the same column from the same people published with alarming frequency. It's not the pundits' fault necessarily. They are who they are, and clearly Trump has broken the part of their brains that used to be able to synthesize new information and develop interesting and compelling arguments. It is, however, the media's outlets' fault for publishing the same deck over and over. Media outlets treat conservative Americans as second-class citizens whose arguments don't need to be listened to or engaged with. Instead, they take the vanishingly small number of column inches or pundit panel seats they have and give the conservative slots to people who repeatedly disparage conservative elected officials, their votes, and their policies. In some cases, the supposed conservatives have long ago renounced their conservatism. The Washington Post's Max Boot, the Washington Post's Jennifer Rubin, and Twitter's Bill Kristol receive a great deal of mockery for their boring obsession with Orange Man Bad, an obsession that has led them to renounce every one of the policy positions they once held. The reason this is funny is because one of my big critiques is, especially Bill Kristol, is I feel like he wakes up, like his day begins with Trump and his day ends with Trump. And any issue in the public space is going to be viewed through a lens of Trump. And when you dislike somebody, or you have this emotional reaction, vitriol, judgment, condemnation for a person, it blinds you. Strong emotion blinds you. And if you don't believe me, just think back to maybe a romantic relationship you had with somebody you shouldn't have been with, and how, or you've seen that in a friendship. This person is dating this other person. They really shouldn't be dating because it's not really, there's some warning flags, but that love blinds those people to some information that might be pertinent to adjusting their sticky narrative. So that's one of my really big critiques of the modern discourse. And it can happen with positive emotions like love. Love blinds. That's a phrase you've probably heard of. And it can happen with very negative emotions like bitterness or condemnation or judgment or hatred or vitriol. And I feel like those are good descriptors of what many never Trumpers are like. And so I think what she's saying is exactly right. They used to be able to synthesize new information, develop interesting and compelling arguments. But when it's all ad hominem through one individual, it stops being persuasive. And I don't know that the people realize this, but it really does stop being persuasive because, well, to me, I know enough about human psychology that if you feel that emotionally about a person, then you're gonna start to, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and if you're a never Trumper, everything looks like a never Trump, fact or justification for that position. So I like this article because I did start to notice in legacy media, in the context of this, preparing for the show. Now, of course, my prior belief is I'm a conservative Christian and Republican, but I've noticed that certain outlets will publish the same thing over and over again, and almost an identical article will appear a day or two later in a neighboring publication. Let's say it appears in the New York Times on Monday, and then it appears on Washington Post on Wednesday, or it appears in the Times on Sunday, and then CNN on Monday. And it's almost the exact same spiel. It's almost the exact same article about the exact same issue with the exact same commentary, just different words. So I thought I'd read that. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it was a good way to dive into the politics section of this show. So the two bits, I don't talk a whole lot about Trump. I've talked about him a little bit earlier, but I feel like there's so much media about him already. I wanted to kind of talk about other big picture issues. I talk a little bit about him with regards to politics and perception and this judgment thing with TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, Orange Man Bad complex, and all the rest. But the two stories I've been really covering the last week or so has been the Michael Flynn case and the Tara Reade case with Joe Biden. So what's interesting is that Real Clear Politics, John Cass has an article that basically talks about both these issues at the same time. And the title kind of gives away what he's talking about in his critique of the media. So the title is Kavanaugh-Biden Double Standard and Lack of Curiosity Over Flynn Make the Beltway Media Look Bad. So that's the piece. That's the title. And I wanted to just read a few paragraphs of this because it's a good way to clarify some thinking and bring together those two stories, which me personally I've been covering and trying to provide some interesting information, because really the only places that are covering the Flynn case is National Review, The Federalist, The Hill. I think those three are the biggest ones, and maybe it'll appear in Fox News every once in a while. But it's interesting that it's only in those. It hasn't been in the Washington Post. It hasn't been in the New York Times. It hasn't been on Vox. And it hasn't been on CNN. So it's completely ignored by half of the media that I'm looking at. And then of the other half, it's only covered by 3 or 4 outlets. So it's a really strange thing. So, and that's the Flynn case. Now the Tara Reade case also was only covered in a few outlets until the major ones almost had to deal with it. And now dealing with it they are, as we'll start to see. So if there were ever a time that American people needed credible national journalism, it is now, during this awful coronavirus pandemic. But for many reasons, whatever trust the people had in news from Washington has been broken over time. Now tens of millions of Americans are out of work, tens of thousands have died, and people are overwhelmed by conflicting and dueling scientific models of the virus. Tribal politics shapes coverage. So, conflicting and dueling scientific models. I talk about the fog of war in life, where we have competing or opposing information, and we have to make sense of it so we can act. And that's very difficult. Americans are so confused and afraid that they have been willing to accept suspension of the Bill of Rights. If that isn't chaos and the foundation of chaos to come, what is? 2 stories out of Washington, the narratives shaped by the Washington Beltway media establishment, illustrate the break. They sit there as the coronavirus consumes the news cycle. One is the incredible double standard in the treatment of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and the Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden over claims of sexual assault. Publicly admitting you are wrong about something is painful indeed. I should know. Many of us admitted that we were wrong about Iraq and the supposed weapons of mass destruction, and many apologized. The other story involves the amazing lack of national journalistic curiosity over the FBI's crumbling perjury case against former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. What Washington pundit or TV talk heads really want to publicly examine how they were manipulated by intelligence sources in a move to take down the president. Oh, excuse me, I read that sentence wrong. What Washington pundit or TV talking head really wants to publicly examine how they were manipulated by intelligence sources in a move to take down a president? Just so there's no mistake here, I am separating journalism into 2 distinct camps. One is made up of local reporters and photographers, and the other is the Washington Beltway crowd of national reporters, newspaper, and TV pundits. Local news reporters tell you what is going on in your cities, at your hospitals, on the ground. Even as a local politician, issue coronavirus edicts and glorify themselves with memes as benevolent autocrats. Local reporters have become ill from the virus. They face layoffs and salary cutbacks in their uncertain times. The Washington Beltway crowd, however, which works in large part as handmaidens to the National Democratic Party, is in a different universe altogether. The double standard between Kavanaugh and Biden is painfully obvious. Both men were hit with claims of sexual assault, but the Washington media and the Democrat Party pounced on Kavanaugh immediately and joined in self-righteous fury to destroy him, running wild claims that he was a leader of a cult of gang rapists, elevating weasels like the now discredited Michael Avenatti, a convicted extortionist, to preen and pass judgment on Kavanaugh before cable news audiences. And Biden? After the story dribbled out about former aide Tara Reade, Biden was not asked about her in several national interviews. It took 19 days for it to be addressed by the New York Times. Now Kavanaugh's most ravenous critics in media, politics, and the Me Too movement find themselves talking about due process if they talk about the accusation against Biden at all. Just Google the name of a pundit, add Kavanaugh and sexual assault, and see for yourself. The Flynn story is perhaps even more disturbing. Reporters tell themselves they're curious, but this story has been met with an appalling lack of curiosity. The FBI's perjury case against Michael Flynn is collapsing. It appears the feds used a perjury trap on Flynn to get him out of the way so he couldn't stop a takedown of a president with that now discredited Russian collusion probe. What's our goal, the FBI official notes in the margins of recently released documents? Truth, admission, or to get him to lie so we can prosecute him and get him fired? So this is a good a good articulation of some things that I've been reporting over the last several weeks, and just some inconsistencies. And in the case of Tara Reade, I covered the New York Times treatment of Tara Reade versus Christine Blasey Ford, as close as I could find to when the allegations broke. And it was extremely different coverage. And then CNN waited a long time to talk. I think this one says 17 days. I think another site was reporting that it was even longer before CNN even mentioned it. And of course, the Larry King interview with Tara Reade's mother didn't even break from CNN. It broke from The Independent. I think it was The Independent. So that's amazing that the actual news outlet that contains the footage didn't break the footage. It had to be broken by an external news agency. So I thought that would set us up to dive into Michael Flynn. And I'm only going to talk real briefly about some developments. I guess there was a August 2017 Rod Rosenstein memo that was released on the origins of the Mueller investigation and the Russian probe. And so Lindsey Graham was on Fox News talking about how the foundation is now crumbling for this whole endeavor of the Mueller probe and whatnot. We'll see. This is something that I think is still pretty recent in the news, and I want to see what the print does with it in the next couple of days. But that's the latest release from the Justice Department, is this August 2017 Rod Rosenstein memo, I think. So there might be other documents being released as well. And then Tara Reade, I just wanted to briefly talk about a piece in the New York Times, because like I said, the media is now addressing this because they have a dilemma. They have a lot of female potential VP picks who had very strong words about Brett Kavanaugh and the Me Too movement back in 2018. Now they are silent or at least non-committal in the allegations against Joe Biden, which I should point out has been way more corroborated by near to the event with other people than Christine Blasey Ford. So I think there's been 4 pieces of collaboration or corroboration in the case of Tara Reade, to include her mother, her brother, and 2 friends. One was a neighbor. And that is 4 times more people than Christine Blasey Ford. She had no one anywhere close to the time of the event that could validate and corroborate her story. So Linda Hirschman in the New York Times, the title of her opinion piece is, "I believe Tara Reade, and I'm voting for Joe Biden anyway," which I thought was fascinating, because this is kind of cognitive dissonance in full display. So this person is basically pinching their nose, but because Trump is so bad that they're pinching their nose and going to vote for Joe Biden anyway, even though they believe that he likely sexually assaulted Tara Reade. That's amazing. I think a lot of Democrats are going to be faced with that same dilemma. And in this article, Linda Hirschman talks about the possibility of replacing Biden and at what cost and what that would look like. But she suggests that the cost is too high to replace him, and that we just need to go with what our best chance is of defeating Orange Man Bad. So that's kind of where the Democrats are going. Now, I still predict that Joe Biden will not be the nominee for the Democratic Party. I think that there's going to be some sort of graceful change. And it could involve his VP pick. It could involve some other convention scenario with Bernie Sanders or somebody else. But I think that his cognitive decline is a fatal flaw. And I think it's not going to continue for very much longer. It could continue into the summer. I would kind of be surprised. I think by the absolute latest, mid-August, we should have a change. Unless there's some political strategy to prolong it and change it more towards the last second, which I don't think that would make sense. But that's my prediction. So short show, only 44 minutes now in my recording. I hope you guys got a lot out of this. I changed up my notes. I talked more about the ideas. I did a little bit less quoting from articles, which I've done more recently. So let me know what you think. And I hope you guys have a great Wednesday, I guess Thursday there in the East Coast. And I will work to get another episode out shortly. Other than that, I'm going to go to bed because I'm tired. Oh, I forgot. Cheers. This is 12-year-old Kirkland single malt Scotch. This blend. No, it's not. So it's not single malt. It's blended Scotch. But there's two Kirkland 12-year-olds. There's this one and there's a fat bottle one. And Scotches take on generically, two kind of flavor profiles. There's a smoky flavor profile and there's more like a clean flavor profile. And my personal preference is the smoky flavor profile. And that's this one. The other one, not so much. So this is a good one. So cheers, 12-year-old blended Scotch from Kirkland, i.e. Costco. God bless you. Have a great night, and I will talk to you guys later.